Hello. Yes, I'm Chandra De Silva. I'm the Vice Provost for Faculty Development. And I bring you greetings from the Provost, and it's my privilege to introduce David Earnest. David and I have known each other ever since he got to Old Dominion University. I'm not going to ask him how our relationship has gone, but I think it has gone well.
It's gone very well.
Yeah. And he, as you know, is Associate Professor of Political Science and International Studies.
That's right. Yeah.
And his topic is something that actually intrigued me. The act of reflection as a means for course improvement. In one sense, I think it's kind of self-evident. If you are really trying to improve your course, you have to reflect on it. But maybe some of us don't reflect on our courses the way that we should. And I'm sure David will tell us how to improve the way in which we approach our courses and our teaching. And David is a major scholar. I have a list of his books and so on and all the articles, but I'm not going to talk about them. Because what we came here for is to listen to David Earnest. So I'm going to say, David, here's your chance. Tell us how to reflect.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chandra. As I was walking over with a colleague, with Aaron Karp, I noted that it's an odd topic to talk about because I'm talking about the act of reflection. So it's a meta-talk. It's a reflection on reflection. When this topic was first proposed to me, when Allison first approached me about giving this talk, what was it, last August maybe?
It was a while back.
It was a while back, so Allison proposed this particular topic, and I said, well, I can probably think of something to say to that, and I agreed to the title, and about 2 weeks ago I said, well, I got to think of what I'm going to say. So had I offered a bit more reflection before agreeing to the title, I would have come up with a title something like this. So how your classroom will change according to the great masters. So the great masters are going to help us think today about the changes that are forthcoming and how we can reflect about those changes, again, for the means of course improvement. So we'll start off with a brief exercise. I want to talk a little bit about these words, reflection and course improvement. I want to problematize those thinking about that. And I want to develop the idea of an educational ecosystem, which is something that I've used to sort of inform my own reflections about how pedagogy, how the classroom is changing, and what those changes may mean for us as we go forward. But one of the key themes I want to develop is we don't really know how these things are going to change for a whole bunch of good reasons we don't know. And I'll talk about that a bit. But the point is that reflection can help us prepare for an uncertain future and how these changes, whatever these changes may be in the educational ecosystem. So these are some of the themes I want to develop today. So we actually have already done our exercise since even before we talked, even before we got started. So you arrived in the room and you saw chairs somewhat randomly organized. And I understand some of you stood there and said, clearly something's going on here. This is purposive. And a number of you sort of looked at each other. A couple of you asked me, what do we do with the chairs? And so I said to my colleague, Jesse Richmond, I said, Jesse, could you please lead the effort to organize the chairs? Did you reflect upon how to organize the chairs? Did you ask yourself, what's the optimal way to arrange chairs so that we can receive this lecture? Did you think about circles? Did you think about other possible ways? A couple of you actually sat in chairs as they were just sort of randomly distributed. Maybe you attributed more purpose and intent to my thinking than was intended, because they were truly random. Right? So one of the points of this exercise is oftentimes when organizations are presented with novel situations, they tend to rely upon familiar solutions. And I would argue they tend to respond reflexively, not reflectively. So our first master of the day is C.R.W. Nevinson. Nevinson was a futurist, an artist who painted in the 20th century. Nevinson served as a nurse on the Western Front for about 9 months in 1914, 1915, and has presented a number of really haunting portraits of the First World War. And this particular piece is relevant both for the theme I'm developing, la mitrailleuse. The mitrailleuse is the French word for the machine gun. And there's an interesting story about the invention of the machine gun and the French military. That's what the machine gun looked like when the French military first developed it in the late 1860s, 1870s. And machine guns originally were very bulky. They were very large. They had to be mounted on wheels and had to be drawn by horses. And the French military saw this new invention, this novelty, and said, you know what? It looks like an artillery piece. So we're going to locate the mitrailleuse with the artillery pieces, and they'll be pulled by horses, and we'll keep them with the artillery pieces a couple miles behind the lines, where they're useless, right? When faced with novelty, organizations respond with familiar solutions. They respond reflexively, not reflectively. So what is reflection? Reflection for many of us oftentimes is simply a couple times a year we print out our course evaluations. Maybe it's when we submit our FIS. Maybe we're all very eager at the end of the semester to know what our students thought about some particular practice that we had implemented this year. And so oftentimes reflection for us is first and foremost the course evaluation. And that's an important element of reflection, but I want to really problematize that because, again, reflection for us, I think, is instinctively something that is self-regarding. Reflection is the incidence of light off of a polished surface that reveals something essential about ourselves. Right? Pablo Picasso, Girl in Front of a Mirror, the idea of reflection and mirror, words that are sort of intimately tied together. But reflection actually, in my view, has to be something we do together. It can't be something that's strictly self-regarding. And that's why I think this conversation series is critical and important. And I think these kinds of conversations are what's going to help us prepare for this uncertain future in the educational ecosystem. So just real quickly, we can participate here a little bit. This isn't strictly me lecturing. What's the difference between a reflex and reflection? Similar etymological roots, but what's the difference? George?
I'd say reflex is instinctual,
okay,
and reflection is intentional.
Okay, good. That's a good difference. Any other ideas?
Coming.
Think of reflex as being quicker and reflection more time to think about it.
Okay, good. Yeah, these were both sort of ideas I had. Any other suggestions? This was a fun exercise for me as I was trying to come up with what's the difference between the two. David, did you want to offer one?
Here I come.
Hold on, wait for the microphone.
Sorry, David.
The one of them seems to be, while it's internal, you can't really articulate it, and whereas the other one seems to be something that's inherently articulable.
Okay, very good. Brandon? We got one. Oh, sorry.
A reflection could be more about assessing what happened before, and a reflex is not really thinking about that.
Okay, good. And I think Brandon had one. Let's get one more here.
Raise your hand, Brandon. Thanks.
Occurs to me that reflection seems to be a response to oneself, whereas a reflex is a response to some external stimulus.
Okay, that's an interesting take, and that's a little different than maybe what I came up with. So as I was preparing this talk and preparing the slide, I just put together a bunch of bullets that I'm not sure we could probably debate some of these points. A reflex often, as we've talked about, is an unconscious, immediate, direct response to an immediate stimulus. Reflection tends to be conscious. It tends to be take time. It takes a little more time. A reflex is involuntary. It's something we can't control, at least in a biological sense in terms of biophysical reflexes. Whereas reflection is a voluntary act. It's something we have to choose to do. And one of the arguments that I sort of thought about as I developed this is reflexes exist. We have reflexes precisely to maintain a condition of stability, to preserve a desirable state of equilibrium. Reflection is something we do when change is necessary. So a reflex is fundamentally about stability, a reflection is about change, and as I've talked about, I think a reflex is something that's individual. It's something that we just do, again, unconsciously and without thinking, but increasingly, reflection has to be a collaborative act. Now, that may be a collaborative act in terms of being co-located in a room and talking. It may be a collaborative act in terms of reading each other's scholarship or the scholarship of pedagogy, but it's clearly a social collaborative process in which we share ideas, practices, successes, and failures. Okay? So reflection is a very different act when you think about its essence than a reflex. So what is a course? If we're thinking about reflection to improve courses, we have to sort of start thinking about what a course is, and one of the interesting features of the moment in which we exist in terms of pedagogy is what a course is actually changing. It's changing quite radically in ways that we don't really understand. And so we can talk about the various different dimensions of what a course is, but I wanted to talk just about two dimensions to sort of give some sense as to the variety of practices we have that you can call a course. I want to talk about differences in delivery mode and differences in learning modes, how students learn. So we can talk about synchronous delivery of content versus asynchronous delivery, and we can talk about learning modes that emphasize active student learning and what you might call passive student learning. The master on this slide, of course, is Dali, and Dali's persistence of memory I only called forth because it's got this wonderful imagery of clocks. And when we think about the emergence of asynchronous course content, we're thinking about time shifting. We're thinking about changing in our conceptualization of time and how the relationship between the giver and the receiver of course content. So with these two dimensions, you can draw a simple 2x2 typology of pedagogies. And again, this isn't exhaustive. I didn't intend for this to be exhaustive, but I did intend it to be just sort of a tool that helps us reflect upon how the nature of higher education is changing and how we can maybe anticipate some of those changes. So a world of active learners who are engaged in synchronous content delivery would be group activities, group exercises that we may do in class or in other forms. Synchronous passive learning is what something I excel at, regrettably. It's lecturing. Students sit in a class and we're all co-located and I drone on for 45 or 50 minutes and I occasionally get a nod and a hand that's waved at me. Asynchronous delivery, of course, is sort of the emergent technology is allowing us to finally do some time shifting in how we deliver content. So asynchronous active learning can be content in which a student is learning by doing, is engaged in some sort of exercise that has maybe a kinesthetic property that allows the student to actively reflect upon the material. And then, of course, you have asynchronous passive learning, which might be an online mode, whereby a student is at a computer, receives a lesson plan whenever he or she wishes, and oftentimes that lesson plan is just David Earnest droning on for 45 minutes, and the only difference is you can't raise your hand to ask a question, okay? So these are sort of four of the pedagogies or four of the worlds that we can think about higher education evolving toward. And I suggested this idea of an educational ecosystem. And when I think of an ecosystem, I think about a couple of dimensions. An ecosystem is characterizing either a space or a time in terms of the distribution of resources. These are resources that may be in a biological sense or an ecological sense, may be resources necessary for the survival of an organism, but also for recruitment, that is, for the perpetuation of the species, for future species. So if we think about an educational ecosystem, that it's the resources we need to be successful teachers and the resources we need to recruit the next generation of teachers. But we also have to think about the distribution of competitors. Who's competing with us for resources? Who's competing with us for teachers of the future? And as I thought about this idea and sort of developed this idea, I began to think about multiple scales of the ecosystem. I thought about, obviously at the lowest scale, we're talking about the face-to-face interaction between the instructor and the student at the individual level. But we have classrooms, we have institutions that we call universities or colleges or institutions of higher education, and then we have this industry as a whole that we call higher education. That's a very heterogeneous place. Many different kinds of institutions, many different kinds of models and practices. Okay, so I like to think about all these scales as I go forward and I think about how reflection can aid our thinking about course improvement. So let's talk a little bit about some of the changes that are going on in the industry of higher education. Now, I'm not a university leader. I don't really think about the industry a whole lot. That may be a disadvantage because maybe I'm misinformed, but it may also be an advantage because I think about these maybe in ways that are a little different. I see my colleague Debbie Bauman here. Debbie and I talked about these ideas a lot this past fall when we were collaborating on the Strategic Plan Steering Committee. So Debbie, this content is not new to you, so you can zone out for the next 5 minutes, okay? So at the scale of the industry, one of the things that Debbie and I and our working group, George was also a member of that working group, we sort of identified 6 trends in higher education that we think are going to really shape the industry over the next 20 years or so, 20, 25 years. I list them all here, but I'll go through each of these on individual slides. One of the big changes that I think is going to affect our classroom is how the government funds basic research. As we see here on this slide, and I think the timeline goes back to about 1978, in most areas of higher education or basic research, federal funding has been relatively flat for the last 30, 35 years. The area where funding has increased is in the health sciences. So, and by the way, I should note, I don't include slides here for the humanities, but the trend line for the humanities is comparable or actually maybe trending downwards compared to sort of the flat line for the other areas, okay? So universities aren't growing uniformly in all directions. The disciplines aren't uniformly growing together. There's growth in some areas are maintaining, and some areas are declining. And this is just the reality of the resources that the federal government is giving to the industry. When you think about our costs, these are trend lines that compare the costs, tuition and fees for four-year universities, and we're comparing public and private universities since 1969, that is the last 45 years. And yes, the costs of higher education have been growing, but there's an important divergence between these lines that occurred about 2000, 2001. And you see that the blue line starts growing faster than the red line. That is, the costs of public education are growing faster than the costs of private education. What this means is that we at public universities, we're losing our cost advantage. Yeah, we're still more affordable than private universities, but we're losing that advantage over time. We're narrowing the gap to private universities. Students are paying more, but they're paying more to pay more. That is, when they finance their student loans, they're increasingly relying upon unsubsidized or market rate loans, right? Most of us, when we went through this system, we paid for our student loans with federally subsidized low interest rate loans. Not anymore. Students increasingly are relying upon market rates, which means not only is it nominally more expensive to go to college, but in real terms it's more expensive because the cost of financing is going up. Okay? More cost pressures on the industry and on the university, and that's going to change our classrooms. I'm not sure how, but it is. Students are preferring online courses. Whereas a decade ago, only about less than 10% of students had taken an online course. Today, about 1 out of every 4 students takes an online course. This is an attractive model for students. And oh, by the way, as we're going to talk about, it's an attractive model for universities as well. Okay? So when we thought about that 4-part typology of pedagogies, we're seeing a trend toward one of those models or one of those modes of delivery. We see the ads. We see the ads on billboards. We see them on television. We see the emergence of for-profit competitors. Enrollments are growing. So the for-profit higher education industry is either bringing new students into the marketplace or is taking students from us, or perhaps both. They're doing a bit of both, okay? But the trend is clear, okay? So what would the Grand Masters say about these 6 trends? This was a challenging one, but I think I came up with a slide. And that's from Vincent van Gogh. Vincent van Gogh, portrait of the postman Joseph Roulin. And Debbie, I apologize because again, this is old content for you, it's old material. I've tried it out on you before. But the line I used in the Strategic Plan Steering Committee is higher education today, institutions like ODU, are kind of like the post office, like the post office was 30 years ago. We have very little control over our costs. We have very little control over our revenues. And technology is lowering the barrier to market entry for for-profit competitors. It's a scary marketplace. It's a scary place for us to be as an institution because we can't control our costs. We face constant pressures to keep our revenues down, keep our revenues down because we have to keep our student tuition down. And the ecosystem is suddenly crowded with competitors for resources. Okay. As I noted, for all those reasons, the model that we're being forced toward is that model. We're being forced away from the model that we think of as the traditional classroom, and we're being forced toward a model that is an online, asynchronous, passive learning model. Okay? That's going to change the way we teach. That's going to change the way our students learn, and it's going to change learning outcomes, I think. So what does this mean in terms of your classroom, the classroom that you traditionally think about? There are two ineluctable truths. At least they seemed ineluctable up until 10 or 15 years ago. There were two compelling reasons to have people co-located in a room for the purposes of learning. Okay? As the Rembrandt suggests, sometimes our subject matter was such that we had to be co-located to study it. Right? Corpses are fortunately expensive. They're rare. And if you want to study anatomy, you have to be co-located. Not everybody can have their own cadaver, for the most part. Okay. Actually, I had a good college friend of mine was in medical school, and in his first year of medical school, I visited him, and he took me to the cadaver lab, and it was about 4 students to a cadaver. But this was a really high-end medical school, so they could afford 4 to a cadaver. Okay. But again, the point is, one of the reasons we have this whole thing that we call a classroom is that the subject matter required us to be co-located to understand the material. And the other ineluctable truth is that we had to be co-located because the other resource was necessary, and that resource was a teacher. Right? There had to be one focus around which learning occurred. And so the Rockwell is a lovely painting, not only because it sort of captures what we think of as the classic model of pedagogy, the attention of individuals, the wisdom of and the delivery of the teacher, okay? And this was a process that had to occur in a social, shared, physical space. Anything on this painting jump out at you? It took me a couple of viewings to look at it. David?
Stove in the middle.
Okay, so a stove. So maybe one of the other things is, right, we had to have some physical plant that required people to be co-located. So in a sense, there were, an economist would say, there are some economies of scale to be had by being co-located. Okay.
I'm
Let's
coming.
wait for the microphone.
Hang on, sorry.
Allison's doing great work.
Talk on the same side of the room.
Francis.
I can tell which student would be on an iPhone if she were here today.
So while you've got the microphone, which student would be on the iPhone?
The girl who's sitting there doing her own thing, reading her book.
The girl on the right-hand side of the picture, right? So this was actually, it was quite interesting because I didn't know this when I selected this picture, but when I had a chance to see it and reflected upon it, that particular student stood out at me, right? Austin?
But I disagree. That's the future PhD student in literature, and the classroom allows for individuality here.
Well, and so in a sense, these competing interpretations of what this student is doing sort of problematize how we think about the classroom of the future. Is this student a successful autodidact? Is she learning on her own? Or is she sort of hopelessly lost in the absence of explicit intervention from the instructor? I don't know. And in fact, when my own sort of personal emotive reaction to this painting was, I can relate to that student, right? I remember when I was that age being a little bored, right? That was a format, the classroom format was a format that I felt was a little constraining, okay? So, one of the things that this suggests is that there are multiple learning styles. We all as professional educators, we understand this quite well, but we have to find pedagogies in this changing ecosystem that allows us to reach all of those learning styles, not simply the attentive students who congregate around the teacher, but those who may exist on the periphery and somewhat are self-guided and self-motivated. Okay? It's a challenge. So the classroom is changing. Lots of things are taking this space that we call a classroom and disaggregating it and tearing it apart. So that, in fact, we know these two ineluctable truths, the centrality of the subject matter and the centrality of the instructor, are no longer necessary. Those are no longer requirements for learning. We've got things like digital books or e-books. We've got all sorts of technologies that distinguish between push learning and pull learning. Push learning is, as the instructor, I determine the content and I deliver it to you on a schedule that I determine. Pull learning is you have a portfolio available to you as a student, and you can demand the content on the schedule that serves your needs. Okay, so we talk about the rise of MOOCs, massively open online courses. Thank you. The rise of MOOCs is an example of pull learning. Okay, one of the areas that Dr. Fish and I have worked on is the area of technology-aided conceptual integration. That is how computers and tools and software can help students make conceptual connections and integrations. And an emerging possibility that I don't think we've even seen yet here at ODU is the rise of ambient computing. There may be a day when a classroom, the one thing that sort of keeps us in a classroom format today is that thing, right? The LCD projector and a screen and a computer, right? These teaching tools that we use now. There may be a day very soon where we don't need any of these. There may be a day very soon where we don't need a computer at the front of the room because, you know what? Each of us walks into the room with a lot of computational power in our pocket. If we just connect an app between us, we've created a parallel computer that's much more powerful than this thing and that we can use in all sorts of active and interesting ways to learn. Right? So this is what I mean by off-ear uses of the smartphone. Right? That is, the phone in our hand can become a teaching tool when the phone on our ear is an impediment. And we haven't yet begun to explore this, but with the rise of the Internet of Things, with so many objects now having IP addresses, and so many objects being able to speak using these IP protocols, there are new possibilities for how we actually organize the use of technology in the classroom. And in fact, ambient computing people talk about how any surface can become a projection surface. So now students can project content anywhere, or at least that's the vision of the future. So the classroom is changing radically. What does this mean for the learning model? Well, again, I think the trend is pushing us this way. The technology that requires active synchronous learning is expensive. It requires a lot of physical plant. It requires that boiler that was in the middle of the Rockwell painting. Whereas the online, passive asynchronous mode of online delivery is relatively cost effective. Okay? One of the interesting things about that model is you might call it the Walmart model of education, and I say that with a lot of respect for Walmart. One of Walmart's business strategies is to get you to pay some of the costs of providing your own product, right? When you buy in large quantities, you have to store it in your garage, right? So Walmart's got you paying for storing inventory, right? When you think about it that way. And it's the same thing with the online mode. We found a way to get the student to pay for the delivery, right? They pay for the physical plant for the computer. They pay for the capital investment in the services of high-speed internet access, right? So there is cost shifting onto the students that makes this affordable for universities. Okay? Again, another trend forcing us towards that lower box. And here's where I think it becomes problematic. Here's where I think problematic's a strong word. Here's where it becomes challenging to us as instructors. We need to think about how this emergence of online education is affecting not just the student, but academic communities. And here I've got the words at the top of the slide, academic capital, which is, I would argue, is a subset of a concept in the social sciences, social capital. Social capital are resources that are embedded in relationships. They're resources that you and I can exploit or use only if we both agree to it. So social capital is things like trust. Right? Social capital is what you exercise when you're cooking, you don't have any sugar, and you go to a neighbor, and a neighbor says, sure, of course you can have a cup of sugar. That's a resource embedded in a relationship. Okay? Social capital or academic capital are resources to students that are embedded in their relationships that they derive in the classroom, that they derive from being co-located with other students. Those are resources such as study groups. The Learning Commons is a fantastic academic capital resource. It's a great investment in academic capital. There are invaluable bits of knowledge that students have about policies and procedures. We're thinking about registration for the fall semester. We're all heavily involved in academic advising right now, and we know how useful it is for students to have knowledge of policies and procedures. And if a student doesn't have knowledge, they have a couple of options. Well, they can try and track down Dr. Earnest when he's not busy, or they can ask their friends in the classroom, right? How do I log on to Leo Online? Or where in the catalog does it say how many credits I can double count for my majors, right? Knowledge of policies and procedures. Extracurricular opportunities. Hey, I heard about this great lecture on campus that's exactly about your topic, right? Mark Granovetter was a sociologist. He called this the strength of weak ties. People you know informally can give you a lot of really interesting information about what's going on in your world that's helpful. And of course, student resources. All sorts of elements of academic capital are critical to student success in the classroom, but they're capital that's spent or exercised outside of the classroom. And of course, it's not just information and resources, it's actually social practices. It's norms of accountability and mutual support. These norms are essential for students to feel like they're members of a community who are receiving caring support, who are receiving the concern of their peers and their faculty, that they have a shared fate. So, as I was thinking about this point, I thought about an anecdote I read about 5-6 years ago. About a decade ago, a couple of the cantons of Switzerland decided to experiment with online voting. Right? Kind of like we're experimenting with online teaching. And the expectation was online voting is going to revolutionize democracy. If you don't have to wait in line, if you don't have to spend gas, or as the Swiss would do, if you don't have to get on the trolley to go to the polling place, if you can do it any time of the day, the barriers to you participating in voting are almost nil. And suddenly the expectation was, with online voting, we're going to see participation rates go way up, the quality of governance will improve, and that didn't happen. In fact, the Swiss, to their surprise, found voting participation rates went down. Any idea why? Okay, David, wait for the microphone.
Maybe there's a social pressure on me to get out and vote that I know my neighbors are going to be watching, knowing
Exactly.
that I'm doing my democratic duty.
Exactly. So after I learned this anecdote, I suddenly had a newfound respect for the people at the polling place when I'm done polling who give me the sticker to put on my lapel, right? Because it turns out that sticker is a very important element of democracy because it's an expression of mutual accountability. Right, David?
When you see me without mine, remember I'm not a citizen.
Okay, all right, so. Well, David, in some places non-citizens can vote, not in Norfolk, but we'll talk about that, okay? So I put up the Bingham's, the county election just as a reminder to me about this paradox that in the world of online social behavior of any variety, whether that's education or voting or others, that the collapse of norms of mutual accountability and support have unintended consequences for our social behavior, for what happens. And this is what troubles me. When we go to the world of online education, we go to a world from very deep social or academic capital to a world of very shallow academic capital. So we're going to have students who don't know don't have access to the resources and information that they need to succeed, that don't feel the support of a caring, committed community. How do we reach them? How do we educate them successfully? At the scale of the student, the changing educational ecosystem, I want to pose two questions. How will instructors use technology differently, and how will students use technology differently? Which brings us to the second of our two exercises. The first exercise we did before we actually got started, but here's the second exercise. What's the answer to this multiplication problem? As you're doing the math in your head, I'll try and talk a little bit and try not to interrupt your thinking. But this exercise was proposed, I learned about this exercise from Uri Walensky, who is a professor of learning sciences at Northwestern University. And he gave this as an example of a point I'm about to make. But Uri said he tried to teach himself how to do multiplication in Roman numerals. Uri's a brilliant guy. He's a student of Thomas Kuhn from MIT. Kuhn was famously known for the paradigm shift. Uri's a pretty brilliant guy, and he said it took him about 4 to 5 months to teach himself how to do multiplication in Roman numerals. Anybody care to hazard an answer? Say it again.
There's no 0 in Roman numerals.
Yeah, you're right. Which is one of the problems with this multiplication. If we were to say, okay, well, because we can translate back into the Roman numerals, that would be the answer, right? The answer would be D C C C X X V I I. What's the answer to this multiplication problem? Well, that's pretty easy, right? 69 is 1 less than 70. 12 times 70 would be 840. So 12 less than 840 would be 828, right? Why was the second problem easier than the first problem? It's the same problem, by the way, right? 69 times 12. Why was it easier to do the second versus the first? Was it simply because it's been a while and you're rusty on your Roman numerals? Any guesses? You suggested one of the problems is there's no 0 in Roman numerals. And in fact, when you study the evolution of numbering systems and mathematics, this was a major innovation, was the symbolic representation of 0. Yeah, okay. Any other ideas? Uri's point when he gave this example was that teaching technologies don't exist in isolation. They depend upon other infrastructure, what he calls knowledge infrastructure. So the story of multiplication is fascinating because multiplication has been around for centuries. And the modern practices of multiplication that Brahmagupta developed emerged in about the 7th century and were known to Western European mathematicians. But it took 600 years for the numbering system to catch up with modern multiplication. It was only with the adaptation of Hindu-Arabic numerals in the 13th century that mathematics suddenly became something we could teach, something that we could teach easily, okay? It's not the technology that matters, it's the simultaneous improvement of complementary technologies that matters. That is, it's the interactions, okay? And so the other example, the great master who can help us on this point is William Blake. I've got his portrait, his thought here, thoughts about Isaac Newton. The same thing happened with the laws of planetary motions. When Kepler and Galileo were developing these laws, they could understand these laws and they could write the laws in, if you will, in longhand. They could use descriptive language, spoken language, to describe the laws of planetary motion. But it was only when we developed calculus that we could make mathematical sense of what those laws meant. And it took, so Galileo and Kepler articulated their ideas in the late 16th, early 17th century, and Leibniz and Newton didn't develop calculus until the mid-17th century. So there was a 50-year gap between, about 50 or half a century between the simultaneous improvement of these technologies, okay? The point is we exist in an ecosystem with lots of things happening, lots of technologies emerging, but we don't know how they're going to work together. We don't know what the simultaneous improvements will be that will be transformative. And Uri Walensky's point was calculus is a dying infrastructure. We don't need calculus now that we have things that we call personal computers. Okay? So these infrastructures are changing radically. Okay? And so what are the students going to make of these technologies? And this gets back to a point I made about academic capital, something that I've been thinking about. I think about the difference between the photo on the left and the photo on the right. Music, for the vast majority of human history, was something that we enjoyed collectively. It was an exercise that we did as communities. And the band shell would be the community gathering spot at which we'd hear music, but it would also be the community gathering spot in which we invested in social capital. We'd talk about the potholes in the street, or the corruption of the mayor, or the lack of funding for the schools. It would be opportunities in which we developed not only these norms of accountability and shared fate, but we'd share information and we'd invest, in a sense, in the betterment of our communities, okay? But technology has made music not only something that we do individually. When we started off, we had sort of bands, and then when we invented recorded music, we had these big, consoles in our living rooms, and then enjoying music became a family exercise. And then we invented Walkmans, and it became a personal exercise. And now it's becoming an exercise that we've got these wonderful little earbuds so that nobody's bothered by the noise, right? It's suddenly a very individual activity. And not only is it an individual activity, but as Apple's marketing experts have shown us, it's an activity that strips us of our individuality. There's something that's really disturbing about this imagery, that the only thing that matters is the product. It's not the person who's enjoying it, right? So there's this homogenizing and individualizing process of the spread of technologies that, again, I think undermines academic capital. So we're moving towards a set of learning outcomes, again, that goes towards the lower right-hand corner. In my view, in my opinion, I'm not a scholar of learning sciences, but in my opinion, the upper left corner is where learning outcomes are the best. The upper left corner is where you get what I would call integration. Integration is not only memory, retention, and recall, but it's integration, synthesis, application, and homologous reasoning. Those are the learning outcomes we want. Integration, synthesis, application, and homologous reasoning. How students can think about not only the subject matter, but how the subject matter helps them think about other problems. That's creativity, that's integration. That's what we get in the upper left-hand corner. In the lower right-hand corner, in the world of passive asynchronous learning, students are good at retention and recall, but they're not good at application, integration, synthesis, and homologous reasoning. Which leads us to John William Waterhouse, Echo, and Narcissus. We're producing a world of students that are self-regarding and are capable of only repeating to us the last thing we said. Right? So we're creating a world of Echo and Narcissus. And this is a challenge. Again, this is my opinion, but this is a challenge. And so the word individuation, this is a word I borrow from sociologists. Individuation simply means there are a set of social practices we have that make us individuals and that break down community ties. And it's the breakdown of community ties that can be so damaging to collaboration and community. So with this dire prognosis, how do we improve our course instruction? And my answer is, I don't know. But that's okay. I put up here the ecological fallacy. The ecological fallacy is that when we see, in the aggregate, we see some organization or pattern, we tend to attribute that organization or pattern to intentional design. And the ecological fallacy reminds us that macro-level structures emerge sometimes through design, but sometimes through accident. So on the left here, I've got a picture of the peppered moth, and evolutionary biologists love to talk about the peppered moth. This is a species of moth that's indigenous to the Midlands of England. And during the era of the Industrial Revolution, there was a rapid change in the morphology of the peppered moth. The peppered moth in nature was more like this, but during the Industrial Revolution, it quickly evolved towards a very dark color. And the reason was, of course, that the soot being produced by the Industrial Revolution changed the ecology in which this moth survived, and the moth adapted. But of course, the great point is no single moth changed, right? It's just the light-colored moths died out. So if I was really cynical, I would have put up Max Planck, right? Max Planck said, science advances one funeral at a time, right? So the cynical answer would be, well, we'll get better, we'll improve, let's just clear out the dead wood, And as an institution, we'll get better, okay? But that's not really reflection, that's natural selection, and that's not what we're here about, okay? I like the Escher simply because, Escher suggests there's hidden order in these things, there's intentionality, and sometimes there's not. So how do we improve in this world? And I think the essence, the answer I come down to is we improve by celebrating heterogeneity, celebrating and promoting heterogeneity in our teaching styles. So I give the example here of the horseshoe crab and the polar bear. The horseshoe crab is a living fossil. Its morphology hasn't changed in something like 300 or 400 million years, right? Needless to say, we've been through, I think, 5 major extinction events in the last 400 million years. The world has changed radically, and the horseshoe crab just keeps ticking along. It keeps doing its thing, okay? Is it terribly sophisticated? No. Does it use a lot of resources? No. But it's a survivor, okay? And it's highly adaptable, okay? The polar bear is extraordinarily adapted, right? In biological terms, it's a niche player. It occupies an evolutionary niche, and it's extraordinarily efficient. It exploits resources very efficiently, but it's threatened by a change in the ecosystem, right? Healthy ecosystems contain a balance of explorers, like the horseshoe crab, and exploiters, like the polar bear. So what we need is a set of practices at the university level where we're sharing ideas. We're all trying new things. We're encouraging explorers and exploiters. We successfully identify successful practices. We promote that, not only identify, but we promote it through forums such as this. And we make sure that reflection is a collaborative exercise. Because the challenge to us is how do we improve when we don't know how the world is changing? And if we don't know how the world is changing, the only way we can improve is through designing these mechanisms of conserving good ideas, selecting and promoting good ideas, encouraging innovation in ideas, conservation, selection, and innovation. Then we create an ecosystem where we are adaptive to changes that we can't anticipate. So I conclude with this slide. The slide on the left is 40 years old now, about 41 years old. I think it was taken in 1973. And so when I put this up, I said, well, the lesson here is that represents about 2 generations of college students, 40 years, right? College students are educated every 20 years or so. 2 generations ago, the world was a very different place, and a lot has changed, and it's hard to know what it's going to look like in another 40 years. But of course, the final lesson is I'm looking in the wrong direction, and therefore take everything I say with a grain of salt, because maybe I'm just not looking in the right place. Thank you. All right, we got about 10 minutes for questions, I think.
Given your concerns about the decline of community and what this poses for academic capital, as you put it, what do you make of really successful online instructors who are creating chat rooms and kind of like Facebook pages within courses which the kids are really relating to in a really positive way?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I should qualify my remarks by saying I've never taught an online course. So yeah, you highlighted an interesting point, which is there are technical solutions to this problem where we can create community that does, provides the same services to students.
And I don't know the answer. I mean, some people though seem to be having an extraordinary amount of success at this versus others. I mean, like.
And so the answer there is what we need those models to become known to the community as a whole. This gets back at my idea about how we need to identify and promote successes and communicate successes to others, because the use of chat rooms, is something I wouldn't have thought about. And I wouldn't have thought about, mostly because I don't personally participate in chat rooms, and so I don't know how they work. But if we have these community conversations, we have these mechanisms for sharing ideas, then we start to cultivate that academic capital in new ways.
I agree with Austin that there are certainly successful models of online learning, but at the same time, there are many of the downsides that you pointed to in your presentation, David. And I think that even the chat rooms are not going to be the same type of interaction and community building that you're going to have with the direct classroom environment. The difficulty that I've found with the movement toward so much of this being online, this digital world, that not only in the classes, but the students who cannot get off of their smartphones, it's all the time, is that it affects us then in the classroom. That's the thing. It's not just a question of how successful are those online classes, but it's what impact are those classes having on the traditional classroom. That's a concern for me, because I think that if the online class, as you're suggesting, reflects more of a passive model of learning, it carries over to the traditional classroom. And I think that that's a real concern. I find that students are more and more that way.
Yeah.
Even when I deliberately make every effort to try to make it a very participatory, active learning environment, and putting the chairs in a circle to encourage that, and so many students still are very reluctant to be in the circle.
Yeah.
I have to go to individually move chairs open and come and join us. It's so difficult for so many students. And I imagine that that's always been the case in previous eras as well. But I just wonder if this is having a detrimental impact on students in terms of the traditional classroom and active participatory environment.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I would sort of respond maybe in two ways, and it's not an entirely satisfactory response. But one idea is here we're faced with a novel situation where suddenly, relatively novel, students have a capacity it's sort of daydreaming on steroids, right? They've got an actual stimulus that allows them to daydream, and again, when faced with novelty, oftentimes we reflexively rely upon solutions that we know from previous experience. We put the students in a circle. We try other things. We try prohibitions in our syllabi, which the students may or may not read. All sorts of sort of traditional solutions for these problems. So I had a thought about this on Monday when I was teaching, just a kernel of an idea, which was maybe we should go the other direction. Maybe we should actually require students to have their phones out and require them to use their phones in the classroom. So if they're going to have them out, let's design our courses so that they have to use it. So I was talking about failed states in class on Monday night, and we were talking about how is Nigeria a failed state. And so I said to the students, well, what does the FP index on failed states say? Where is it ranked? And so the students had to go online and they had to look it up, right? So if we build into our curriculum requirements that they actually use their cell phone, after a while they're going to resent it and they're going to put them away, right? But we'll deal with that problem when we get there. But again, it's trying to think in novel ways of when faced with this novel problem, coming up with novel solutions versus rote, familiar, reflexive solutions. Which is not to say that's what you were doing. I'm just suggesting. Yeah.
And I completely agree with you on that point, because I think students expect our reflexive response instead of the reflective response. So when I start doing things like Poll Everywhere, which is a tool they can use on their cell phones, and it's built into lectures, and I'm saying, well, Google it. We've got to figure this out. Let's do this. I mean, they really respond very differently. They are shocked and appalled that I expect something of them other than to hide in Facebook during the middle of class.
Yeah.
And it really changes the course dynamic over time. So I don't know if it's just that they expect us to do something completely, to be so opposed to it that we start to ignore them. I don't know what they imagine we're going to do with the ones who are constantly playing on their cell phones. But certainly in my course, it's worked for me to kind of change my immediate response, which is the mom response, put that down. Yeah. But I found that just failed miserably. So if I say pick that up, that works a little bit better.
And what was the name of that technology you're using?
Poll Everywhere, which is really simple. You can get a free subscription to it, and basically you can build in a poll. So if I ask my students a question, I teach poetry workshops. So if I ask them, what forms of formal verse have evolved in contemporary American poetry, they can just use a text to say, I think the sestina has really evolved. And you get to see all of their answers start popping up.
That's great.
Even in a PowerPoint or, immediately. So they also get this they get some of that community response back. That slide about the music and the way we
Yeah.
deal with community, it also made me think of the fact that students today don't have a space that they can gather and understand that they have a common interest. We're losing that as well. So I just wanted to ask about that. You know, how do we build spaces so students understand that they're coming to a space of common interest and they don't feel so individualized?
Yeah,
if that makes
yeah,
sense.
I think that's an excellent question. And, you know, as I mentioned, I think the Learning Commons has been enormously helpful in that respect. You know, one of the ironies is, of course, in BAL, we're in a building that's 40 years old when these considerations didn't figure into the configuration of our teaching spaces. And so as we go forward with, you know, the provost has this initiative on the classroom of the future. These are the kinds of conversations we need to be having in terms of spaces where students can develop this sense of common shared fate. You know, I was at a convention yesterday, it was actually an academic convention, where they did some polling of the audience members, and we had little respondus clickers. And that too is an interesting example of a solution to this problem. Suppose you do a poll, because when we did it, we could see on the screen how many people had voted, right?
Yeah.
If I've got 14 students and I've only got 13 clicks, I know somebody out there isn't paying attention, and I can sort of speak up and I can say, okay, whichever among you hasn't voted, you know, click something, right? We're not going for it. I can't advance the slides until until I get to 14. So again, sort of an interesting creative solution to what seems to be a problem. Yeah, good.
I have been teaching online for a few years, so what I found with online and what disturbs me is one of the words that you put up, it can get rote.
Yeah.
It can be so consistent and the same. So as an online instructor, it takes a lot of creativity, like what you were talking about. You really have to get into the high technology. You spend a great deal of time doing that. Much like we do in a face-to-face class, you spend a great deal of time organizing it, but once you have it designed and you're teaching the same course, I found that when the new thing comes out, you can add it and take this out, and you can add that and take that out. And with one of my courses that I teach online, I get them busy out. You know, it's like homeschooling.
Yeah.
You know, you homeschool your student, but you send them out to different places to still learn, and that's what I do with, you know, with a lot of my online classes. But I have found that you can get in a rut as a professor and have same.
Yeah.
And that's where I think we lose the learning.
Yeah, I think.
Or you could send them to the library and say, you have to go to the library to go get this and interact with people.
Yeah. Yeah,
So-
I think those are great examples of finding ways to encourage active learning even in an online format. So Jennifer Fish and I, although we've used this with sort of traditional quote-unquote seminars that we've done, we've got an exercise where we require students to gather content. They actually identify the content, and then they have to write the analysis, and they can only provide it in an online form. So it's rather than them just simply receiving content that we're providing, you know, Jennifer's got this great word. It's the co-creation of content. You know, instructors and students together are creating content and learning about it together, and that's an active learning form that I think we found reasonably successful.
You'd be surprised that as I've taught for several years now online, I get to know my students simply because even though I don't maybe see their face, they will show me a picture. In their writing and in the way that they interact that way, emails, or you kind of get who that person is. And my Facebook is full of students that I've had that I've never met before. So I think it's promising, but I think we definitely have a lot of work to do. And I don't think we should ever just do one or the other. I mean, I think we should do both.
Yeah, and I'm a horseshoe crab. I'm kind of one of these living dinosaurs, because as I prepared my preview for this talk today, I said, you know, my teaching training was half a day. That was my teaching training in graduate school. Half a day, oh, by the way, in 1997. So I have no preparation for this world, and as I said, I've never taught online. So the only way I'm going to sort of move towards the polar bear end of the continuum is if I have these conversations with colleagues. And of course, you know, we talk about the individuation of students. We have the problem of the individuation of faculty as well, because we exist in academic departments. We're all extraordinarily busy people. We don't talk to each other every, I see Ozan's in my department, I see him, once a week, and we exchange pleasantries. I really like Ozan and I respect him as a teacher, but that's not the model that I need, because Ozan he's been trained more recently than I have. He's got a lot of really interesting creative ideas, and I need to sort of push through those sort of institutional pressures to make sure we're having these conversations that allow for the transmission of really creative ideas.